Hi everyone, it's Mr. Carroll. Today we're going to be talking about Renaissance Italy. Renaissance is the French word for rebirth. It comes from the Latin renatio. I put it in quotation marks here because it is a problematic term, and it's not actually what the Italians and the scholars and people living during this time would have called their time period. But we'll talk more about that at the end. The 1500s in Italy saw a rise in the idea of humanism. This is the study of man's ability to improve the quality of life on Earth through studying Greece and Rome, and their monuments and their texts and all the things that come with that. It is not a rejection of the church, though, as some people like to believe it. It's kind of a melding of the two. We'll talk about more of that in a famous scholar, St. Thomas Aquinas, in a future video. Now, how did these texts of Greece and Rome kind of come about? Why weren't they always being studied? They kind of fell out of use. The Greek texts fell out of use with the separation of Rome into the western and the eastern halves. And the Byzantines kept studying these Greek texts, and they all had them in the eastern half of the Mediterranean. But the Western Empire kind of was infighting and dealing with everything there and all the trouble that war brings with fighting. When there's war going on, not a lot of people are studying. They're usually trying to make sure they don't die. So with kind of the settling of peace, all right, people are now able to start to study more of these texts. Also, there's a lot of trade going on at this time with the Ottoman Turks, who had just recently conquered the Middle East and Turkey in that area in northern Africa. And this trade also comes with an exchange of ideas and sharing of ideas. It's really hard to kind of trade with someone if you don't trust them. It's also at this time that Genghis Khan and his descendants had reopened the Silk Road. And so now people in Europe are starting to trade again with China and the Mongol Empire that's over there. And so that brings about another exchange of ideas. The Crusades saw a lot of Europeans going to far off lands and learning new things while being there. Granted, there was a lot of bloodshed that occurred with that, but it meant that there's new ideas are starting to propagate throughout Europe. And the fall of Constantinople is a final point in how these ideas started to spread out again. With the Ottoman Turks taking Constantinople, a lot of Greek scholars fled because they didn't want to be ruled underneath the Ottoman Turks. Now, this by no means meant that Constantinople was shut off as a city. It was actually still one of the most important cities in this time for book production, and so a lot of Europeans still went to Constantinople. It just meant that there were some people there that didn't like the new government, and so they left and settled in cities like Venice and Florence and Rome and brought new ideas with them. Also at this time just recently had passed, was the Black Death. This happened between the years 1347 and 1352, and it probably actually was brought about because of Genghis Khan and the reopening of the Silk Road. But because almost 25 to 30 million Europeans had died, this also caused a shift in redistribution of wealth. It was no longer the same families who had all the same money, all right? And because some of those families had died and wealth was able to be shifted there, it also happened that workers, because their labor was in demand, could ask for better wages. And in all of this kind of back and forth and shifting of ideas and trading and death and everything that's going on, Italy is right in the middle of it all, primed to be kind of a connector between the eastern half of the Mediterranean and the western half of the Mediterranean. And so we start to see this rise of ideas. Italy also happened to be right next to a lot of the ruins and old architecture from the Roman Empire, and they were able to study it as well. So we have so just to review, we have this rise in humanism, which is the study of man's ability to improve by studying Greek and Rome, both the ruins and the texts. We have a huge complicated network of ideas being spread at this time, which is bringing some of the Greek and Roman books back and also rediscovering some of those Greek and Roman books. We have a redistribution of people and wealth because of the massive death involved in the Black Death. And Italy is right primed in the middle of the Mediterranean, where all of this is kind of going back and forth. So trade is really the big reason why the Renaissance starts to occur at this time. It's really hard to make new ideas and build large churches and to paint beautiful things and think about things when you are hungry or worried about getting conquered in war. And usually trade doesn't occur when there's a lot of war happening, just kind of one of those things that occurs. Trade usually gets shut down. So with this trade, it means that there's a period of peace, and it means that there's money around for people to spend on stuff. All right, but even by gathering all this wealth, you don't just sit on it. You want to show off that you have the wealth, so you sponsor a lot of projects. Now, Italy has many port cities because it's a peninsula, and so there's a lot of cities right along the coast, and it also has a lot of industrial centers. Venice is being one of them, Florence being another, Milan being a third. All right. And an interesting thing is all these cities are still competing with each other, and instead of unifying like in the Kingdom of England or the Kingdom of France, they're all kind of having squabbles with each other. Not full-out wars, but they're kind of jostling for power. And part of it is because the Pope doesn't want any one city in Italy to become the most powerful and to rule over the Pope. So the Pope is worried about his own secular or worldly position, and so he's keep making sure the cities are keeping separate from each other. And so all this trade is occurring where there's lots of wealth being traded along the Silk Road, and Italy is trading with kingdoms of England and France and Spain, and it's also trading with the Ottoman Turks and the Umayyad part of Spain that is still holding on, and the Abbasids before they get conquered by the Ottomans. And there's all this wealth kind of going back and forth. And the Italians decide that the people who are gaining this wealth want to do something with it to show that they are wealthy. And so they start sponsoring artists and architects and all sorts of people to bring about new kind of ideas. So Florence is one of these important cities. It's one of the major centers in the Renaissance. It attracted many artists, sculptors, writers, and architects because of all the money that was there. It's on the River Arno, and it is surrounded by walls and towers for defense, so it's pretty safe to be able to work there. Again, war is a terrible time for artists and sculptors and writers and architects. Nobody wants to be carving when people are fighting with swords and shooting bows and arrows at each other. Banking and cloth production are the important industries in Florence. Banking is when they can charge interest on loans that they give. And the florin, or the gold coin of Florence, is a measure of value that is pretty valuable throughout all of Europe. So everyone is demanding to hold on to gold florin, and that makes it scarce, which makes it even more valuable. Cloth was also important. Florence was one of the only places that had a mineral called alum, which allowed for very bright dyes to be put into cloth. And so they had a rare resource that they were able to use in the production of cloth. The Medici family, who you saw, that was Lorenzo de' Medici on the first slide of the show, he owned one of the banks and also the rights to mine all the alum, and so became very powerful and sponsored a lot of these projects and a lot of these artists, and also influenced the politics of the city. The Medicis were one of the people that actually sponsored the dome that you see here in the picture of the Cathedral of Santa Maria, which is the main church in Florence, and it was created by Filippo Brunelleschi in 1436. And it's actually one of the greatest engineering achievements of the time. Before that, the Romans were the last ones to make a dome this big in the Pantheon down in Rome. So this is a really kind of a sign of wealth, that they're able to spend so much money to put together such a unique architectural item. Venice was another important city for Renaissance Italy. It's a city in the sea. It was there for defense when all of those Germanic tribes were conquering each other in the Middle Ages, that, as we talked about in the last chapter. People went out onto the islands that made up Venice for protection, and they built because they're on islands, they got really good at becoming sailors and shipbuilders. There's actually a part of the city called the Arsenal where workers would build wooden ships and make sails and oars for those ships. It was so important they dedicated one part of their city for that. They got a lot of their wealth because they were the closest city to the Ottomans, and they were able to trade pepper and cloth with them, which the Ottomans had a bunch of pepper and they loved Venetian cloth, and so they're paying a lot of money. And so again, just like in Florence, the Venetians are getting a lot of money, and they're wanting to show it off by building these giant buildings and these churches and sponsoring painters there. Now, with all this new money, we also get a new class in the hierarchy, which is this upper class of bankers and artisans. All right. Originally in Italy, it was used to be noble families who would pass down land from father to son, and they held on to this land, and that was the only way you could be wealthy in Italy. But now, with all this trade, they are getting. This is where these new people, are getting their wealth, and they also want to then have a say in the government. And so, a lot of republics begin to form at this time. Now, a republic is a government in which power comes from the citizens, but we got to remember, in Italian city-states at this time, not everyone is citizens. You usually had to be wealthy and male. But these citizens are coming together in groups and ruling together as for the best interest of the city. And so in Florence, the Medici family actually controlled the government from 1469 to 1492. All right, that was when Lorenzo de' Medici kind of was the highest person in the government and influenced how it was shaped. But also, at this time, there was a lot of peace, and because of these complex relationships, there also had to be a lot of diplomacy. And diplomacy, remember, is the art of making an agreement with other countries without going to war. All right, and the Italians did this, and it meant that they weren't wasting energy fighting each other, and instead could make agreements on who got to trade with whom, and who got to sail where, and who got to sail into what port. And this kind of helped prevent a lot of excess money and manpower being wasted in war. You can see in this photo here from Siena, there's a knight who is going between cities, with a scroll in his hand, and this is part of the fact that he's going to do diplomacy. It's also maybe one of the earliest portraits we have in Italy from this time period. Now, with all this, we also get new ideas of how to be a diplomat. And one of those is a guy named Niccolo Machiavelli. He is a diplomat in Florence who tried to answer the question, how could a ruler keep on to hold in power in the Italian states when it's a bunch of people coming together and working as committees to kind of keep the peace, but also make sure that their interests get met. He wrote a book called The Prince in 1513. Which takes a critical look at the politics in Italy at this time. It's where we get the term Machiavellian, where a person in power is being cunning and acting without a conscience. And it comes from this quote from the Prince. He said, Machiavelli said, "Upon this a question arises, whether it is to be better to be loved than feared, or feared than loved. It may be answered that one should wish to be both. But because it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved." So all of these new wealthy people, the factory owners, the bankers, the Medici, they're all ruling with kind of this idea in the back of their head of, it's better that I'm a ruthless ruler and I kind of hold on to my power as long as I can, even though I can't take full power and become a king. I have to still work within this committee and this diplomacy stuff. So that's our video for today. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them below in the comments.